In the past 10 years, China has created new global standards for digital governance, from internet censorship to surveillance through smart city projects, and even to space. It does this through public and private partnerships with Chinese tech companies. These partnerships are how China helps governments and institutions launch digital initiatives. Things like 5G cybersecurity test labs in Malaysia, mobile payment in Thailand, data centers in Nepal, surveillance cameras in Phnom Penh and Kathmandu, submarine cables in Cambodia, and satellite systems for Thailand. These partnering countries then adopt PRC-style of cybersecurity laws and policies. Now, China has moved to influencing multilateral cooperations through forums like the United Nations and ASEAN. I spoke with researchers who have analyzed China's ambition for digital governance in Indo-Pac. Their updated report, Cybersecurity with Chinese Characteristics, ends with examples of a Taiwanese alternative. My name's Emily Waiwu, and this is The Taiwan Take. And here's my conversation with Michael Castor and I-Chen Liu, Liu Yizheng from the Research Center, Article 19.
Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you for having us.
At Article 19, you've been tracking how countries have been adopting China's style and standards of digital authoritarianism. You've analyzed cases of 7 countries, at least, so far: Malaysia, Nepal, Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Vietnam. Before we talk about some of China's priorities and how they have shifted over the years, can you give us a bird's eye view on how this began?
Sure. So it began really, as you said, a decade ago with the sort of formal, calling into existence of the digital Silk Road, which, we argue isn't necessarily, best thought of as a distinct foreign policy on its own, but it's an umbrella concept wrapping together all of the policies, priorities, tools, technologies, tactics, of a digital nature under the larger Belt and Road Initiative. And so in 2015, Digital Silk Road was formally established under the BRI. But its sort of first instance came a year earlier in 2014, when the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology first started calling for or raising awareness of the need to take China's digital priorities and activities and sort of efforts in informatization and put it under the BRI. And 2014 is really a critical date in, I think, understanding a lot of this, because it's also the year that the State Internet Information Office was sort of rebranded as the Cyberspace Administration of China, and the first year that China hosted the World Internet Forum in Wuzhen. And so over the last decade, what we've seen is a combination of various state and party institutions like the CAC, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, and others, working together with the erstwhile private sector, some of the tech companies, the national tech champions, and a range of other actors from United Front Work Organization, sort of people-to-people exchange. And so what we've seen is over a decade, China really going through its Belt and Road Initiative, partnerships, pushing a variety of digital priorities, from digital infrastructure development, and with those have often come the adoption of digital governance norms.
So as China helps a lot of these developing countries build out their digital infrastructure, it's things like internet connectivity, it's mobile payment, it's cable networks. These are really great technologies that can really benefit citizens on the ground. But what has been the risk for these countries? What does China get in return?
When China is persuading these countries to adopt the Chinese version of the digital governance norms, what we are seeing is actually a shift of global norms on digital governance. So I think before China is doing all this work, I think the general consensus that the internet should be stateless, should be decentralized. But China is introducing a different digital governance norms by cooperation with these countries, by providing them capacity building initiatives. And when these countries are adopting these practices, based on their own needs, like very real need. These countries may have suffered like cyber attacks. They need to develop their own cybersecurity defense capabilities. Those are very real needs. But when they turn to China, they're actually adopting these practices and eventually also promoting these different kinds of norms that was different from originally what we pictured of a digital governance norms that promotes multi-stakeholderism and a more decentralized model.
Is there an example from one of the 7 countries that you study that really illustrate this this point of maybe it's the labor talent exchange, and that really in turn comes to really harm the host country?
I think one of the interesting case I can think of right now is perhaps the Indonesian case, because I think Indonesian case is that they also have their very real concerns for their lack of cybersecurity capabilities. So they turn to China, and China does provide some kind of capacity buildings to their related institutions, such as their Cyber and Crypto Agency, BSSN, and also the Ministry of Information and Communication, the Kominfo. And because they did suffer a lot of cyber attacks, so eventually they did turn to China. And after the 2017 MOU between the BSSN and also the CNCRT, they did emphasize that in the MOU, they will introduce the cyber sovereignty and data security governance. And after that, joint trainings, programs, capacity building initiative started, and a lot of practice are normalizing the PRC version of the cybersecurity governance norms in the Indonesia. And also Huawei plays a crucial role in introducing these norms. When they are developing Indonesia's 5G networks, they also help to shape Indonesia's cyber incident response and also the national cybersecurity standards. And those will may have like real impact on how China is influencing Indonesia's cybersecurity norms. And also there were some concerns about how these may lead to the backdoor access and also dependence on PRC technologies.
If I can just add, briefly on that as well, thinking more from, the sort of guidance from the party or the directives from the party. In 2020, the Central Committee also issued its opinions on strengthening the united front work of the private economy in the new era, which was a party directive that explicitly instructed the private sector, and in particular, sort of the emerging strategic industries, which again heavily includes all of the national tech champions who are key players, small scale partnerships to large scale, whole of country digital infrastructure rollout, right? And it required them to play a role in the united front work activities, which means promoting not just a positive image of China, but unswervingly following the party, to quote, and to promote party priorities and policies in all of their engagements. It directed them to take a more active role in BRI construction, which includes obviously Digital Silk Road related and any number of other cooperations. But what we see from this 2020 document is really an explicit directive from the party to the so-called private sector in all of their engagements in digital cooperations, in developing out the tools, the technologies, with these countries. Doing so with a lens to how is it promoting the party and how is it especially promoting its priorities, which again lead to adopting and normalizing its digital governance norms, which are very much again away from universal values and principles and things like this.
What was the point that you found that you really saw signs that China was ready to elevate from country to country bilateral relations to international systems, to the United Nations, to ASEAN?
I mean, early on in the documents, guiding opinions, 5-year plans, the sort of core documents that have come out over the last decade of digital Silk Road activities. Early on, there was identifying, China to regional blocs or, multilateral bodies. ASEAN is a critical sort of, regional bloc that China has identified as having a strategic priority under this. The sort of Indo-Pacific region. So while obviously pursuing, development, cooperation, memorandums of understanding on anything from, rolling out 5G to, smart cities and things, a lot of this is done through the regional level. And then, there's a value in that because if China is engaging with ASEAN as a bloc of 10 member countries, then it seeks to normalize its practices for all 10 member countries. And then you scale that out to the global level, right? It's like the old sort of Maoist adage of, circling the city from, the countryside around it. What we identify in the latest report and what we argue is not just that multilateralism is a norm of China's digital governance, but what that means is very concerning because it doesn't really just mean that China says, oh, we'll cooperate at multilateral fora like the UN and ASEAN or these blocs, but it means two things really. One is that when China talks about multilateralism, they're doing it as a renouncing multi-stakeholderism approach. So denying civil society, the tech sector, academia, other independent actors, they're denying them a seat at the table. And so that's one. And the second really is that China's not just talking about working through the existing, regional and multilateral bodies to pursue these objectives. They're creating and positioning their own to ultimately supplant those that have existed for decades, or some obviously that go back all the way 80 years to the original sort of post-war international rules-based system. And so examples of some of these new China created, regional or global multilateral bodies, the Global Security Initiative or the Global Development or Civilization Initiatives, or for example, the World Internet Conference.
Later this year in July, the United Nations Cybercrime Convention is expected to be signed. This is a resolution that was sponsored by Russia and backed by regimes like China, Cambodia, Belarus, Iran, Nicaragua, Syria, and Venezuela. With all this in context, how much of a landmark is this and what should we be looking out for?
The first UN General Assembly resolution calling for the creation of this, cybercrime treaty goes back to 2019. So this current process has been going on for a number of years, and Article 19 has put out a number of analyses, and we've engaged, our colleagues and other teams have engaged, in the process. We have been clear from the beginning that there's a number of concerning, provisions, and some of those really have to do with normalizing the retention of user data, law enforcement cooperation, cyber-enabled crimes rather than cyber-dependent crimes, which basically means things that can be done on or offline, but there are enhanced sentencing if they're done online, which are used often in countries from Thailand to Pakistan, for example, to further restrict freedom of expression online and so forth. So there's a number of concerns within the convention itself. And the fact that the resolution was first called to a vote by basically a who's who in terms of, internet freedom predators. The history, the origins of this convention are quite concerning. But now the fact also that Vietnam is hosting the signing, and that it will presumably henceforth be known as the Hanoi Convention, especially in light of some of the findings in our report, which maybe I'll turn to I-Chen to touch on a bit more in terms of where we have seen China's influence in Vietnam in terms of leading to Vietnam emulating some of the very same digital authoritarian norms that relate to cybersecurity, cybercrime, and others. And so, of course, the concern with this convention that's flawed to begin with, being signed now in Vietnam, will not just potentially risk whitewashing Vietnam's record, but again, because we see China's sort of shadowy influence along a lot of this sort of normative shift, it will then further risk normalizing this approach to cybercrime and cybersecurity that China has been promoting. So countries like the United States and some others who sort of begrudgingly, perhaps, accepted the text as it was last year. They, of course, did so with certain reservations that, look, it needs more human rights safeguards that can then be put into place at a state-by-state level. But the convention itself is what it is. And so we know that globally, it's normalizing a certain approach that will not see national level safeguards put into place by the countries that pushed it to be what it is today.
I think the case of Vietnam shows that China's influence is not only in the economic sectors and not just only in investments, but also influencing other countries' legal frameworks and how they govern their own digital sphere and the cybersecurity. In Vietnam's 2018 cybersecurity law, the legislation and legal frameworks a lot of times are very similar to the cybersecurity laws in the PRC. The influence of that can actually all the way trace back to, for example, 2011, where an article published in the Vietnamese newspaper, where it analyzed the PRC laws and regulations on content moderation, the real name registration, and also how the use of firewalls in Vietnam as a potential. So a lot of the studies and research were already done from Vietnam, and also how they can incorporate the PRC's legal framework on cybersecurity in Vietnam, which lead to the later very controversial legislation of the 2018 cybersecurity law. And in these cybersecurity laws of Vietnam, we see that not only it mirrors China's cybersecurity laws in requiring data localization, real name registration, and also providing governance some kind of backdoor access for the user data. And also it encourages that the provisions to combat anti-state speech, which may also lead to a stronger censorship and also other problematic human rights issues. So we see that the legal framework is also one battleground when China is trying to promote its own norms. It's not only through monetary incentives, but it also gives other potential authoritarian actors a toolkit about how they will use cybersecurity laws in the name of promoting safety or national securities, but actually introducing these potentially humanitarian disaster laws that will actually impact the rights to freedom of expression and also the right to privacy.
You mentioned real name verification and real name registration when it comes to internet use. Do you look at how China continues to update those laws versus how it's being adopted abroad to make comparisons and recommendations?
The 2017 cybersecurity law in China, really placed the legal requirement for real name registration that was drawing on some, previous guidelines that predated that. A few years after the cybersecurity law in China, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, MIIT, put out its guidelines on VPN registration, basically creating a whitelist of accepted VPNs. And actually, some people have, been imprisoned for up to 5 years for distributing VPNs that were not, part of this whitelist. More recently, cut forward to just last year, the Cyberspace Administration on China, put forward draft guidelines, one of the newest, which would require a national internet ID. And so, really, we do see this as one of the sort of, normative shifts, the sort of approach to digital governance that China has pushed is this effort to require identity verification at every step of possible, online activity, which makes it almost impossible to have online anonymity, which in a report a few years ago, the former Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kaye, was quite explicit that the right to freedom of expression is, intrinsically linked to the ability to be secure and safe online. And at times that requires anonymity or, protection of Article 17 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, protection for the right to privacy. And so really, as part of this approach, it's a chipping away of your right to privacy, it supercharged surveillance, and it obviously disincentivizes people from expressing themselves or gaining information freely. So it's really, this approach is obviously very problematic from a number of perspectives. But it's not just happening in China, as you say. Through its, cooperation agreements, its efforts to promote quote unquote best practices, which is a code for China's practices in these partnerships, we again see emulation of all of these types of things taking place. So again, just in our latest report, for example, cybersecurity with Chinese characteristics, two of the country case studies we look at, Vietnam and Pakistan, we've seen a number of these same policies and requirements being put into force. Vietnam has required through a few decrees under its cybersecurity law the same type of requirement for real name registration. The Pakistan Telecommunications Authority has also, just as of last year, really been calling for an approach to whitelisting VPNs in the same way, really, that we've seen from the MIIT in China. And then we see this in a number of other places. So several years ago, for example, with the white paper protests in November 2 years ago, one of the ways that people were spreading information, promoting the protests, was through a feature in Apple AirDrop, which allowed people to quite freely share information in their close vicinity. To close this hole that was available for evading censorship in China. China put out policies requiring that particular type of protocol for airdrop would require, again, identity verification, contact listing, more ephemeral messaging. So they put out a number of policies. But again, one of them relates directly to this issue, again, about real name identity verification and requirements, which later then Apple rolled out some similar changes, which it was criticized for doing, potentially in pressure from China. But so, we see how both in the relationships it has with some of the countries in this region where we have done our research, but also in other parts of the world, but also how some of this approach has even led to changes at international tech companies that unfortunately, again, raises very serious concerns around freedom of expression and right to privacy online.
So if China's leading the charge in digital authoritarianism, right? So who is leading the charge on the other side? What is the state of the internet divide going forward? In your newest report, I-Chen, you had a section on using Taiwan's case studies. Can you talk a little bit about what have you seen that's worked here?
I think Taiwan is an interesting case because, China is framing the big needs for national security. Taiwan also suffers a very real national security threat and a lot of threats in its cybersecurity governance. For example, Taiwan is one of the most targeted countries for cyber attacks. According to the National Security Bureau, Taiwan suffers 2.4 million attacks per day targeting government agencies. So that's a lot of cyber attacks.
And Taiwan is a day. 2.4 million attacks.
2.4 million attacks per day. Yeah, I think that's a double the number from a year before. So they have also upscaled in their cyber attacks. And Taiwan is also the country that are most affected by disinformation, according to the VDM Institute, for years. Not to mention the gray zone tactics from cyber operations and also the different disinformation and influence campaigns. And the newest trend is also the attacks on the physical layer, where our undersea cables will be cut multiple times throughout the years. So the threat is very real for Taiwan. But I think under these circumstances, Taiwan still developed its own cybersecurity governance norms that try to balance the threat and also the commitments to human rights. The Cybersecurity Management Act set as the cornerstone as the legal framework. But when Taiwan is developing these legal frameworks and doing amendments to fit the newest trend of cyber attacks, we see that public consultation is still applied in steps. For example, when the Cybersecurity Management Act is having a newest version of amendments, these amendments are still put online on a public policy participation platform, which is a website for different people can comment and respond. People would question that whether these newest amendments have too much audits or they have too little intelligence sharing. And we do see that government officials and the civil society and people from the tech sectors will interact in these online public consultation platforms, and they will exchange the ideas on how to balance these concerns of human rights, public accountability, transparency, and also how Taiwan should still develop its own cybersecurity capabilities. But we're not trying to frame like Taiwan as a perfect example. It still has like a lot of rooms to improve. And it's a continual struggle to balance between national security and also human rights.
What sense do you get of Taiwan's participation in the global cybersecurity discussions that's countering China's style? So if China's leading this initiative, right, and they have signed agreements and partnerships with close to 100 countries, how should we be paying attention to this space to see that there is a counter and on the global stage to China's dominance?
I mean, certainly one of our, our prevailing recommendations is for Taiwan to play a more, engaged role in international, internet and broader digital governance, which is not necessarily an easy thing to say because, of course, through, coordinated political, economic, sharp power and other influence, campaigns and threats from China, Taiwan has been, intentionally isolated and sidelined in the global, governance space. And so, obviously, to say that Taiwan should be playing a more active role is challenging to follow through on. But certainly, things like where the UN Internet Governance Forum takes place. Exploring opportunities to ensure that representatives from Taiwan can join into these critical conversations. That is happening later this year in Norway, for example. Last year it was in Saudi Arabia, so the global sort of digital rights community largely boycotted the proceedings. The year before that it was in Japan, and unlike some previous years, the Japanese government or local organizers did make some concessions to allow for participants from Taiwan to join. And so this is one, forum, certainly. There's a number of other places where this is taking place. And so certainly what we would like to see is greater inclusion at the regional and at the global level. And it's not just, Taiwanese government, but Taiwanese civil society, the larger civic tech community that I-Chen was talking about. And so, I think certainly this is one place where there is a large gap in terms of the knowledge, the experience, the expertise that can be brought into global conversations that just isn't happening. And again, it's largely happening by design because of pressure from China, refusing them access. And so, that's certainly one major shift that we would like to see and we advocate for in the report. In terms of who's leading the charge, unfortunately, to engage in such a massive mission of both digital infrastructure development and the promotion of governance norms requires, vast amounts of resources that require a state to have the political will behind allocating necessary resources and the participation and adherence to universal values and international norms. Previously, the United States was, putting effort into cybersecurity and other infrastructure development. Unfortunately, again, previously, those efforts were already inadequate to properly combat China's influence in this space. And now, most recently, because a lot of those efforts were actually overseen by and funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. The slashing of their budget will now have a negative impact on the U.S. role in a lot of the efforts to counteract what China is doing from the infrastructure to the governance space. The European Union has a global gateway initiative, which is firstly promoted as sort of a European values-driven counter to the Belt and Road Initiative, but it has digital components in it as well. Certainly this is one place that, we would like to see greater attention placed on, ensuring that the human rights-based digital governance norms are mainstreamed in the other, digital infrastructure and other infrastructure cooperation that the EU has through the Global Gateway Initiative. Japan as well is a major, major development partner, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but really around the world. Traditionally, they have been very quiet. They haven't been as self-promoting, let's say, as China has, which again is because development is very much part of China's soft power projections and sort of narrative and information, operations. And so while Japan has, in some cases, actually invested more money in development in around the Indo-Pacific, the awareness of that level of support isn't necessarily there. But in recent times, the Japanese development strategies have also shifted to, again, more support for digital-related development cooperations, and then also with certain companies that might also be the ones engaged in, say, 5G rollout, like Ericsson from Sweden and others, as well as obviously, ensuring that multi-stakeholder approach is there. So not just that this is not just a matter of marshaling high budgets from states. We also need to ensure that civil society, that academia, that other independent actors, certainly journalists, have a critical role, not just in, ensuring that there's transparency around procurements or, sites of, satellite base stations or fiber optic landing stations, all of this on the ground. In Taiwan, right, we talk about whole of society approach, but we really, in terms of the global resistance to ensuring that, human rights are maintained, that internet freedom principles are maintained, we also need a global sort of whole of society approach, because certainly the attack, the assault, championed by China is systematic and coherent and strategic, attacking at all sort of pillars. And so we need to be sort of equally strategic in our response.
A lot of these recommendations that you've made, they're for civic society, they're for enterprise, they're for government, for policies. But when it comes to an individual listening to this, what is something that they can do?
I think as an individual, one thing we can totally do is to donate to grassroots initiatives that supports the monitoring and also the research on these digital governance norms or Chinese investment. I think one thing we observed in the Indo-Pacific region is that a lot of the grassroots initiatives actually have the interest to work on China-related topics, or they want to research on how Chinese investments or engagements are impacting the human rights condition in the country. But the lack of resources or the skill sets to actually do those research or monitoring. So providing them with more resources would be, I think, it's a very asymmetric leverage that we as an individual can do.
It's difficult, I think, to say because, everyone is in a different situation in terms of, what they're, capable, what they're comfortable taking on. And, sometimes, we do our research and, we do our advocacy, and it feels a little, it can feel a little disconnected from the fact that, there are very serious, risks and threats that exist in terms of any work related to potentially critiquing or forestalling, party priorities. And the threat of transnational repression is very real. And so, I mean, I think that, while of course, we make our recommendations and, we talk about what, actions we would like to see different stakeholders take. Obviously we can't, be forcing, or we can't be expecting, or we can't be critical of people who choose to do less, because, again, really the threat, is very real. I think, understanding that is also, very critical. Understanding for ourselves, I mean, what is our own personal, level of risk that we're willing to take, and being okay sometimes with, not putting ourselves in unnecessary harm's way. But it also means that, again, perhaps not at the individual level, but more at the society level. And as I-Chen said, in terms of, not just the, say, material support, but the community support, the solidarity, because sometimes, the value of symbolic gestures and solidarity and support, can also go, an exceedingly long way.
Thank you for that. What can we look out for next from Article 19?
Well, this wasn't intended as a transition, but actually, we do have a report forthcoming on transnational repression. We're looking at, in particular, China's acts of TNR against protesters around the world. We have case studies in 11 countries or so in Asia, North America, and Europe, looking at Hong Kong or Uyghur, Tibetan, other diaspora communities protesting around Chinese state visits, outside of embassies and consulates, forms of digital transnational repression against protesters, as well as some of the psychosocial impact that comes with that. So this report is forthcoming, so we're excited about that. And also, I think maybe I-Chen can talk a bit more, but we're also doing a bit more, building out some work in terms of lessons learned in Taiwan from FIMI in Taiwan, and then linkages with some of the lessons learned from Ukrainian civil society and being targeted by Russian FIMI.
I think it's very exciting that we are starting a project to bridge Ukrainian expertise and Taiwanese civil society's expertise on countering FIMI. Since Ukrainians are the people that knows Russian FIMI the best, and Taiwanese may be the people who knows PRC FIMI the best, I think it's great that we have an opportunity to bridge these two groups and combine forces on learning not only how Russia and China is having a convergence in terms of information operations, but also exchange skill sets and provide capacity building initiatives on providing better opportunities for the civil societies on both sides. As the conflict in Ukraine is continue, I believe a lot of Taiwanese will still have the urge to learn from Ukraine, but also to help Ukrainians on their circumstances.
Thank you so much both for today. For our audience who's interested, cybersecurity with Chinese characteristics, there's also a Mandarin version, and we'll have the download links of those reports in the show notes for you. Thank you, Michael Castor, Head of Global China Program at Article 19, and Liu I-Chen, Asia Program Officer at Article 19. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Emily. It was great.
Thank you for having us.
This has been the Taiwan Take from Ghost Island Media, based in Taipei, Taiwan. I'm your host, Emily Waiwu. This episode is made with help from Zach Jiang and Wayne Tsai. See you next time.
鬼岛之音
Ghost Island Media.